Look at your hand right now. Really look at it. The lines crossing your palm, the shape of your fingernails, the exact way your knuckles bend, every single one of those details exists because roughly 74,000 years ago, something almost wiped your ancestors completely off the face of the earth. Here is something that should genuinely unsettle you. Every human being alive today, all 8 billion of us, shares an almost identical genetic blueprint. We are more closely related to each other than 2 chimpanzees living in the same forest. And geneticists believe they know exactly why. Something catastrophic happened to our species. If you are using this to fall asleep tonight, that is perfect. These mysteries have waited 74,000 years. They will still be here when you wake up tonight. We are going to explore what might have been the closest brush with extinction our entire species has ever experienced. Subscribe and stick around. In the northern part of what is now Indonesia, there sits a lake. It is called Lake Toba, and it is beautiful. Tourists visit it. People swim in its waters. But that peaceful lake is actually the caldera of something far more terrifying. It is the scar left behind by one of the largest volcanic eruptions in the last 2 million years. Lake Toba stretches roughly 100 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide. To put that in perspective, that is larger than some entire countries. And all of that space was created in a single cataclysmic event. When Toba erupted approximately 74,000 years ago, it fundamentally changed the course of human history. Geologists classify volcanic eruptions using something called the Volcanic Explosivity Index. It runs from 0 to 8, with each number representing a 10-fold increase in explosivity. Mount St. Helens in 1980 was a 5, Krakatoa in 1883 was a 6. Toba was an 8, that is as high as the scale goes. To understand what an 8 means, consider that Krakatoa killed 36,000 people and was heard 5,000 kilometers away. That eruption registered on instruments around the world. Toba was approximately 100 times larger than Krakatoa. The comparison becomes almost meaningless at this scale. When Toba erupted, the initial explosion would have been heard across most of Asia. The shock wave would have circled the globe multiple times. Pyroclastic flows, those superheated avalanches of gas and rock that can travel at hundreds of kilometers per h-hour, would have devastated everything within a radius of perhaps 100 kilometers. Anything living in that immediate zone would have died instantly. The temperatures in a pyroclastic flow can reach 800 degrees Celsius. Nothing survives. Trees are incinerated. Animals are killed before they can even begin to flee. The landscape is sterilized down to the bedrock. Beyond the immediate kill zone, the falling ash would have buried landscapes under meters of volcanic debris. Ashfall from Toba has been found as thick as 6 meters in parts of Malaysia and 4 meters in parts of India. Imagine 6 meters of ash falling from the sky. That is roughly the height of a 2-story building. The evidence for this eruption is written in stone all around the world. Geologists have found layers of Toba ash in deep-sea sediments from the Bay of Bengal to the South China Sea. They have found it in ice cores from Greenland. The eruption left its signature across an entire hemisphere of our planet. When researchers analyze these ash deposits, the numbers are staggering. Toba ejected an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of volcanic material. For comparison, the 1980 Mount St. Helens eruption produced about 1 cubic kilometer. Toba was nearly 3,000 times larger. This was not just a big volcano. This was a planetary-scale event. Now here is where the story gets truly terrifying for our ancestors. When that much material gets launched into the atmosphere, it does not just fall back down immediately. Fine volcanic ash and sulfur dioxide spread around the entire globe. They formed a blanket that blocked sunlight. And that is when the volcanic winter began. The sulfur dioxide released by Toba would have combined with water vapor in the atmosphere to form sulfuric acid aerosols. These tiny particles are remarkably effective at reflecting sunlight back into space. The more sulfur in the atmosphere, the less solar energy reaches the surface. Researchers estimate that Toba may have released as much as 6 billion tons of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. For comparison, the 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo released about 20 million tons and caused global temperatures to drop by about half a degree for 2 years. Toba released 300 times more sulfur. Climate models suggest that global temperatures may have dropped by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius after the eruption. That might not sound like much, but in climate terms, it is enormous. During the last ice age, the global average was only about 4 to 7 degrees cooler than today. Toba potentially pushed the world into ice age conditions almost overnight. Some models suggest the temperature drop could have been even more severe in certain regions. The tropics might have experienced cooling of 5 to 10 degrees. Northern latitudes could have seen even more dramatic changes. Growing seasons would have shortened or disappeared entirely in many areas. Some researchers estimate that the volcanic winter lasted between 6 and 10 years. Imagine that. For nearly a decade, summers were cold. Crops would have failed if there had been any crops. Forests would have died back. Animals that depended on those forests would have starved. The entire food chain was disrupted from the bottom up. Large animals would have been particularly vulnerable. They need more food, take longer to reproduce, and cannot adapt quickly to changing conditions. Megafauna populations that were already under stress from the ongoing ice age fluctuations might have been pushed toward extinction by this additional catastrophe. But small mammals and certain hardy species would have found ways to survive. Underground burrows provide insulation from temperature extremes. Seeds can remain dormant in the soil for years, waiting for conditions to improve. Life is remarkably persistent when given even the smallest chance, and somewhere in this devastated world were your ancestors. At this point in history, anatomically modern humans had been around for about 200,000 years, but our entire population was still confined mostly to Africa. We had made some tentative moves into the Middle East, but we were still a relatively small species. Estimates of the human population before Toba vary widely, but most researchers believe there were somewhere between tens of thousands and a few 100,000 individuals. That is a tiny number compared to today's billions, but it was a significant population spread across a large continent. Our ancestors were hunter-gatherers, living in small bands that moved with the seasons and the migrations of the animals they hunted. They had fire, they had tools, they had language, but they had no defenses against a catastrophe on the scale of Toba. The question that has obsessed scientists for decades is simple but profound. What happened to human populations during and after this catastrophe? Did we almost go extinct? And if so, how did we manage to survive when so much else was dying around us? The answers are still being debated. The fossil record from this period is frustratingly sparse. Human bones are fragile and rarely preserve well. The few specimens we have from around the time of Toba tell us little about population sizes or health. This is one reason why geneticists have become so important to the Toba debate. They can read the history written in our DNA, even when the physical evidence has long since turned to dust. The genes of the living carry echoes of the dead. In 1998, geneticist Stanley Ambrose proposed what became known as the Toba catastrophe theory. He had been studying human genetic diversity and noticed something peculiar. For a species spread across an entire planet, humans are remarkably genetically similar to one another. We lack the variation you would expect. Ambrose was building on earlier work by other geneticists who had noticed the same pattern. When you compare the DNA of humans from different continents, the differences are surprisingly small. Two people from opposite sides of the world might differ at only about 1 in every 1,000 base pairs of their DNA. Here is the thing about genetic diversity. It accumulates over time through random mutations. The longer a species exists and the larger its population, the more genetic diversity it should have. Chimpanzees have been around roughly as long as humans, yet they have far more genetic diversity than we do. That is genuinely strange. Consider this comparison carefully. A troop of chimpanzees in a single African forest may contain more genetic diversity than the entire human species combined. All 8 billion of us are less genetically diverse than a few hundred apes. This is one of the most striking facts about our species, and it demands an explanation. Other great apes show normal levels of genetic diversity for their population sizes and evolutionary ages. Gorillas, orangutans, and bonobos all have the genetic variation you would expect. Only humans are the outliers. Only we show this strange pattern of recent common ancestry. Ambrose proposed that this lack of diversity could be explained by a population bottleneck. At some point in our history, the human population crashed to a very small number. Only a few thousand individuals, perhaps even fewer. Then that tiny population slowly recovered and eventually expanded to become the billions of us alive today. A bottleneck works like a filter. When a population crashes, most of the genetic variation is lost. Only the alleles carried by the survivors make it through to subsequent generations. As the population recovers, new mutations slowly add diversity back, but the starting point is impoverished. Think about what that means. Every human alive today might be descended from a group small enough to fit in a single town. All of our apparent differences, the variations in appearance and culture that seem so significant, emerged in just the last 70,000 years from that tiny ancestral population. Some estimates put the bottleneck population as low as 1,000 breeding pairs. 2,000 people total trying to survive a global catastrophe. That is smaller than many high schools, That is the entire human species, reduced to a population that could attend a single concert. The timing was suspicious. When geneticists traced back the patterns in human mitochondrial DNA, they kept arriving at roughly the same window. Somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago, something happened that dramatically reduced human genetic diversity, and that window conveniently includes the Toba eruption. Mitochondrial DNA is special because it passes directly from mother to child, without mixing with the father's genes. This makes it ideal for tracing maternal ancestry back through time. Every person alive today inherited their mitochondrial DNA from their mother, who got it from her mother, and so on. By comparing the mitochondrial DNA of people from different populations, geneticists can estimate when their maternal lineages last shared a common ancestor. The pattern across all humans points to a surprisingly recent coalescence, suggesting our species went through a severe bottleneck. Ambrose connected these dots. The largest volcanic eruption in human history occurred precisely when genetic evidence suggested a population crash. The volcanic winter would have created exactly the kind of environmental stress that could devastate human populations. It seemed like a compelling story, perhaps too compelling, because here is where the mystery deepens rather than resolves. Not everyone agrees with the Toba catastrophe theory. In fact, in recent years, some researchers have begun pushing back against it quite forcefully. The evidence, they argue, is more complicated than it first appeared. The first problem is one of timing. The Volcanic bottleneck and the Toba eruption both fall in roughly the same window. The connection is circumstantial. Correlation does not prove causation. The genetic dating techniques have significant margins of error. When you go back tens of thousands of years, the bottleneck could have occurred anywhere from 50,000 to 150,000 years ago. Toba happened 74,000 years ago. The overlap is suggestive but not conclusive. One major problem is that archaeologists have not found the smoking gun they expected. If Toba really did devastate human populations, you would expect to see evidence in the archaeological record. Abandoned settlements, a sudden decline in artifacts, some sign of catastrophe. But the picture is surprisingly unclear. At archaeological sites across Africa, the story told by the stones is ambiguous. The kinds of tools people were making before Toba look remarkably similar to the kinds of tools they were making after Toba. If 90% of the population died, you might expect to see some reflection of that trauma. At several African archaeological sites that span the Toba period, researchers have found something unexpected. Human occupation seems to continue right through the volcanic winter without obvious interruption. The same kinds of stone tools appear above and below the Toba ash layer. Whatever happened, it was not visible in the archaeology. The site of Pinnacle Point in South Africa is particularly interesting here. Archaeologists have found evidence of continuous human occupation spanning the Toba period. People were collecting shellfish, making tools, and leaving their debris in the cave deposits without apparent interruption. Curtis Marion, who led the excavations at Pinnacle Point, argues that coastal populations in South Africa were largely unaffected by the Toba volcanic winter. The marine food sources remained available, the climate was buffered by the ocean, and people continued their lives with minimal disruption. A 2018 study led by Chad Yost examined sediment cores from Lake Malawi in Africa. They found Toba ash deposits in the lake bed, proving the eruption's effects reached deep into Africa. But surprisingly, the environmental data did not show the catastrophic changes the theory predicted. The sediment cores from Lake Malawi are like a book written in mud and microscopic organisms. Each layer represents a different time period. By analyzing the types of pollen, charcoal, and other materials in each layer, scientists can reconstruct what the environment was like thousands of years ago. The researchers expected to find evidence of vegetation collapse and drought in the layers corresponding to the volcanic winter. They expected to see a dramatic shift in the types of pollen preserved in the sediment. Instead, they found surprising continuity. This suggests that East Africa, at least around Lake Malawi, was not severely affected by the volcanic winter. Life in the lake and on its shores continued without catastrophic disruption. The vegetation did not collapse. The ecosystem did not crash. This is where the science gets genuinely complicated. Climate is not uniform around the world. Even during a volcanic winter, some regions would be affected more severely than others. Perhaps humans survived precisely because they were in the right place at the right time, in a region that remained habitable. Some researchers have proposed that coastal regions in Africa might have served as refugia during the volcanic winter. The oceans have a moderating effect on temperature, and marine food sources might have remained available even when terrestrial ecosystems collapsed. Perhaps our ancestors survived by the sea. Archaeological evidence from Pinnacle Point in South Africa supports this idea. Researchers have found evidence of shellfish consumption dating back roughly 160,000 years. Our ancestors were already exploiting marine resources long before Toba. Perhaps this coastal adaptation saved them during the crisis. The caves at Pinnacle Point overlook the sea from high cliffs. For tens of thousands of years, humans used these caves as shelters, leaving behind the debris of their daily lives. Stone tools, animal bones, ash from their fires, all preserved in the sandy deposits. But here is the thing. Even if coastal populations survived, that does not necessarily mean they were reduced to just a few thousand individuals. The genetic evidence for a severe bottleneck has itself come under scrutiny. Some geneticists now argue the data can be explained by other mechanisms. One alternative explanation involves something called population structure. Instead of all humans being one freely interbreeding population, our ancestors might have existed in many small, partially isolated groups across Africa. This structure can create patterns in genetic data that look similar to a bottleneck. Imagine the human population as a network of small villages, rather than one continuous mass. Each village has limited contact with its neighbors. Genetic variants that arise in one village spread slowly, if at all, to other villages. A 2013 study by Aylwin Scally and Richard Durbin suggested that the apparent bottleneck might actually reflect the small effective population sizes of these ancient hunter-gatherer groups, maintained over hundreds of thousands of years, rather than a sudden catastrophic decline. This interpretation is elegant because it requires no catastrophe at all. The low genetic diversity we see today would simply be the legacy of how our ancestors lived in small bands with limited genetic exchange for most of our evolutionary history. But here is where it gets complicated. The structured population model and the bottleneck model are not mutually exclusive. Both could be true. Our ancestors could have lived in small, semi-isolated groups and experienced a catastrophic decline during the volcanic winter. The genetic data we have today reflects everything that happened over hundreds of thousands of years. Separating the effects of population structure from the effects of bottlenecks is extremely difficult. The signal is there, but reading it clearly requires better methods than we currently possess. This is what makes the Toba debate so fascinating. We are looking at the same evidence and reaching different conclusions. The low genetic diversity is real. The eruption definitely happened, but the causal link between them is far from proven. Science does not always give us neat answers. Let us talk about what we actually know happened during and after Toba. Regardless of whether it caused a bottleneck, the eruption was a major event that definitely affected human populations in some way. The question is the magnitude and duration of that effect. In India, the Toba ash layer has been found at numerous archaeological sites. At Jawalapuram in the Juraru Valley, archaeologist Michael Petraglia and his team made a remarkable discovery. Stone tools appear both below and above the ash layer, and they are strikingly similar. This suggests that whoever was making those tools before the eruption either survived through the volcanic winter or was replaced by people with virtually identical technology. Either interpretation is significant. If they survived, it means the effects were survivable. If they were replaced, it means human populations were resilient enough to quickly recolonize devastated areas. Petraglia's work has been controversial. Some researchers question whether the tools were made by anatomically modern humans or by an earlier hominin species. The debate continues, but it highlights how difficult it is to reconstruct what happened so long ago from such fragmentary evidence. Other Indian sites tell similar stories of continuity. At Dabba in the Sun River Valley, researchers found Middle Paleolithic tools spanning from roughly 80,000 years ago to about 25,000 years ago, with no obvious break at the Toba horizon. People kept making tools the same way they had before. This does not mean Toba had no effect. It is possible that populations declined dramatically, but the survivors maintained their cultural traditions. You can lose 90% of a population and still have enough people to continue making the same kinds of tools in the same ways. The archaeological evidence from South Asia suggests something nuanced. Perhaps Toba caused significant hardship and population decline, but not the near extinction that the more dramatic versions of the theory propose. The survivors kept going, adapting to the changed conditions, maintaining their way of life. And this brings up another fascinating aspect of the Toba story. We were not the only humans around 74,000 years ago. Neanderthals were living in Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans were somewhere in Eastern Asia. Homo floresiensis may have been on the island of Flores. It was a crowded world. If Toba really did cause a catastrophic population crash, did it affect all these human species equally? The timing is intriguing because most of these other human lineages went extinct within the next 40,000 years. Is that just coincidence? Or did Toba weaken them in ways that eventually led to their disappearance? We genuinely do not know. The genetic evidence suggests that Neanderthals also went through bottlenecks during their history, but connecting any specific bottleneck to Toba has proven difficult. The data simply is not precise enough to draw firm conclusions at this level of resolution. What we do know is that Neanderthals were living in Europe and the Middle East at the time of Toba. They had survived multiple ice ages and warming periods. They were adapted to cold climates in ways that modern humans were not. If anyone could have survived a volcanic winter, you might expect it to be them. Yet, the Neanderthals were gone by about 40,000 years ago, roughly 30,000 years after Toba. Did the volcanic winter weaken their populations enough that they could not compete with the wave of modern humans that arrived shortly afterward? The question haunts the study of human evolution. The Denisovans are even more mysterious. We know them almost entirely from their DNA, extracted from a few bones found in a Siberian cave. They were living in Asia during the Toba period, and apparently survived long enough to interbreed with modern humans who entered the region later. Today, people of Asian and Oceanian descent carry small percentages of Denisovan DNA in their genomes. This tells us that Denisovans survived at least until modern humans arrived in their territory, which was well after Toba. Whatever happened to them, it was not instant extinction from the volcanic winter. Some researchers have tried to use ice cores to understand the climate effects more precisely. Ice cores from Greenland preserve a record of atmospheric conditions going back hundreds of thousands of years. Volcanic eruptions leave chemical signatures that can be identified and dated. Each year's snowfall in Greenland gets buried by subsequent snow, compressing into ice. Air bubbles trapped inside preserve ancient atmosphere samples. Volcanic ash deposits leave visible markers that can be measured and identified across tens of thousands of years. The ice core record does show evidence of the Toba eruption and its immediate climate effects. But interestingly, the long-term impact appears less severe than some models predicted. The volcanic winter was real, but the Earth's climate system may have recovered faster than previously thought. The sulfuric acid aerosols that caused the volcanic winter do not stay in the atmosphere indefinitely. Within a decade or two, gravity and rain wash them out. The atmosphere clears and sunlight returns to normal levels. This is actually consistent with what we know about other volcanic events. Ecosystems are surprisingly resilient. After the devastation of the initial eruption and the subsequent cold years, life begins to return. Seeds survive in the soil. Animals migrate back from refugia. The recovery can begin surprisingly quickly. The first plants to return are usually the pioneers, species that specialize in colonizing disturbed ground. They are fast-growing, produce abundant seeds, and can tolerate the harsh conditions of recently devastated landscapes. Within years of even the most severe eruption, these pioneers begin their work. Where plants go, animals follow. Insects arrive almost immediately, some carried on the wind from unaffected areas. Birds follow the insects, small mammals follow the plants and seeds. The food web begins to reassemble itself, link by link, species by species. Within decades of a major eruption, even severely affected areas begin showing signs of recovery. Within centuries, you might not even know a catastrophe had occurred. For our ancestors, surviving the initial crisis might have been the hard part. The recovery would have brought new opportunities. Volcanic winter would have been brutal, but it was not permanent. Within a decade, perhaps two, temperatures would have begun returning to normal. The sulfuric acid aerosols would have gradually fallen out of the atmosphere. Sunlight would have started reaching the surface again at full strength. For the humans who survived those hard years, the return of normal conditions would have felt like a miracle. Food sources that had been scarce would become abundant again. Populations that had barely hung on could start to grow. The worst was over, and here is something remarkable to consider. Within a few tens of thousands of years after Toba, something extraordinary happened. Modern humans began spreading out of Africa in a wave of migration that would eventually carry them to every continent, except Antarctica. This is often called the Great Expansion. Some researchers have suggested that the Toba bottleneck, if it happened, might have actually played a role in this expansion. A small, genetically similar population might have developed certain cognitive or social advantages that helped them outcompete other human species and adapt to new environments. Within 50,000 years of Toba, modern humans had colonized every habitable continent on Earth. They crossed the sea to Australia. They walked into the Americas. They pushed into the frozen north of Siberia. This was an expansion of truly global scale. Some of these migrations required remarkable feats of navigation and endurance. Reaching Australia meant crossing at least 60 kilometers of open ocean, even when sea levels were at their lowest. People built boats and made the crossing, carrying their entire way of life to a new world. The populations that survived Toba would have been the most adaptable and resourceful. Perhaps those qualities gave their descendants an edge in competing with other human species and colonizing new environments. The survivors of Toba and their descendants went on to colonize environments their African ancestors could never have imagined: frozen tundra, tropical rainforests, high mountain plateaus, isolated islands. Everywhere they went, they adapted and thrived. Did the extreme stress of near extinction forge our ancestors into a more adaptable species? Did the survivors possess some quality that had been selected for by the crisis itself? These questions drive ongoing research into human evolution and resilience. Shortly after the Toba window, we see an explosion of symbolic behavior in the archaeological record. Complex tools, art, personal ornaments, evidence of long-distance trade networks. Something was changing in how humans thought and related to each other. The timing may or may not be coincidental. The use of red ochre becomes much more common in the archaeological record after about 70,000 years ago. This mineral pigment has no obvious practical use, but it appears in burial sites, on tools, and on the bodies of the living. It seems to have had symbolic or ritual significance. One theory suggests that the stress of the bottleneck period forced humans to develop stronger social bonds and more sophisticated communication. If you are trying to survive a catastrophe with only a few thousand of your kind, cooperation becomes essential. Language and culture become survival tools. Consider the challenge facing those survivors. They needed to share information about food sources that were constantly changing. They needed to coordinate their movements across landscapes that had been transformed by the volcanic winter. They needed to maintain social cohesion even as stress threatened to tear groups apart. Personal ornaments like shell beads might have served as social glue, markers of identity and alliance that helped bind people together across distances and through difficult times. When resources are scarce, knowing who you can trust becomes literally a matter of life and death. But we need to be careful here. It is tempting to construct neat narratives where catastrophe leads to triumph, where near extinction forges a better species. The reality is almost certainly messier. Evolution does not have a plan, and disasters are not teachers with lessons to impart. What we can say is that our ancestors survived. Whether they survived a catastrophic bottleneck that reduced them to a few thousand individuals, or whether they simply endured a difficult period in populations that remained larger, they made it through. And here you are, 74,000 years later, the proof of their success. Think about that for a moment. Every person you have ever known, every human being who has ever lived in recorded history, every artist and scientist and explorer and ordinary person, all of them trace their ancestry back to those survivors of the volcanic winter. The surgeon who might one day save your life, the musician whose songs move you, the teacher who shaped your thinking, all of them exist because some ancient humans found ways to survive when survival seemed almost impossible. The specific individuals who made it through are lost to us. We will never know their names or their stories. We do not know if they huddled in caves by the coast, eating shellfish and waiting for the sun to return. We do not know if they moved to higher ground or lower ground, or just stayed where they were. But their genetic legacy is written in every cell of your body. The mitochondrial DNA that passes from mother to child connects you to an unbroken line of women stretching back through the volcanic winter to the earliest members of our species. You are literally carrying ancient survivors inside you. Every time your cells divide, they are copying instructions that were first written in the bodies of those volcanic winter survivors. The code has been modified and updated over the generations, but it traces back directly to them. You are a continuation of their story, and here is where the uncertainty becomes almost beautiful. We may never definitively know exactly how close humanity came to extinction. The scientific debate will continue, new evidence will emerge, and our understanding will evolve. But the fundamental mystery will remain. What we do know is that we are a young species by evolutionary standards, and we carry the marks of our history in our genes. Our lack of diversity compared to other primates tells us something happened, even if we argue about the details. Compare us to almost any other widespread species on Earth. Look at the genetic diversity in wolves, or elephants, or whales. They all show the normal pattern of variation accumulated over hundreds of thousands or millions of years. Humans are the strange ones, the ones with the unexpectedly shallow gene pool. Some researchers estimate that our effective population size during the bottleneck period may have been as low as 10,000 breeding individuals. Others put it somewhat higher. A few argue there was no bottleneck at all in the traditional sense, just the normal population structure of a geographically spread species. The honest answer is that we do not know for certain. We have pieces of evidence that can be assembled in different ways. We have models and theories and interpretations. What we lack is a time machine that could show us exactly what happened 74,000 years ago. What we can do is keep investigating, keep questioning, keep refining our understanding. That is the scientific process at work. Today's controversial theory might become tomorrow's accepted fact, or it might be replaced by something better that we have not yet imagined. But even the uncertainty teaches us something important. Science is not a collection of fixed facts, but an ongoing process of investigation and revision. The Toba story shows how new evidence can challenge old assumptions and how honest scientists are willing to update their views. 20 years ago, the Toba catastrophe theory seemed well established. Today, it is being seriously questioned. 20 years from now, we may have new evidence that resolves the debate one way or another, or the mystery may deepen further. Somewhere right now, an archaeologist is digging at a site that might contain crucial evidence somewhere. A geneticist is analyzing ancient DNA that might rewrite the story somewhere. A climate scientist is modeling the volcanic winter with new precision. What is beyond dispute is that Lake Toba sits there in Indonesia, peaceful and beautiful, covering the wound in the earth where something enormous happened. Tourists swim in the caldera. Farmers grow coffee on the surrounding slopes. Life has long since reclaimed the site of devastation. The Batak people who live around Lake Toba today have their own stories about its origins. Science offers a different kind of story, built from ash layers, genetic markers, and climate models. Both help us understand where we came from, and 74,000 years from now, will anyone remember us? Will our descendants carry our genetic legacy forward, the way we carry the legacy of those ancient survivors? Or will some future catastrophe finally accomplish what Toba perhaps nearly did? These are the kinds of thoughts that come at 2 in the morning, when the world is quiet and the mind wanders freely. The deep time scale of human history puts our individual lives in perspective without making them meaningless. You are here because generation after generation of your ancestors managed to survive long enough to have children. Through ice ages and volcanic winters, through famines and floods, and all the ordinary dangers of prehistoric life, an unbroken chain of survivors led directly to you. That chain is longer than you can easily imagine. Roughly 3,000 generations separate you from the Toba survivors. 3,000 times someone survived to reproductive age, found a mate, raised children to adulthood, and passed the torch of life forward. Every choice they made, every danger they avoided, every successful hunt and every narrow escape, all of it was necessary for you to exist. Change any single link in that chain, and you would never have been born. Your existence is the result of an improbable sequence of survival stretching back millions of years. But the Toba period may have been one of the narrowest passages through which that thread of continuity had to pass. The Toba story reminds us how fragile that chain really was. There may have been a moment 74,000 years ago when the entire human future hung in the balance. A few thousand individuals huddled against the cold, carrying the potential for everything that would follow. They had no way of knowing what they were preserving. They were just trying to survive another day. Find enough food, stay warm, protect their children. The everyday heroism of getting through difficulty without giving up. And in a way, that is still what we are all doing. The catastrophes we face are different now. Climate change, pandemics, the various ways we have invented to threaten our own existence. But the fundamental challenge remains the same: survive. Adapt, continue. Perhaps the Toba story has something to teach us after all. Not a lesson exactly, because nature does not teach lessons, but a reminder we have been through catastrophes before. Our ancestors found ways to survive when survival seemed impossible. The Toba survivors could not have imagined cities or computers or the 8 billion people their descendants would become. They lived in a world of immediate dangers and small social groups. Their horizons were the edges of the territory they knew, yet they made choices that reverberate down through time. Their survival was your origin. Their resilience is encoded in your DNA. Whatever qualities helped them make it through the volcanic winter, you inherited those same potentials. Maybe it was cooperation, the ability to work together in small groups, even under extreme stress. Maybe it was adaptability, the willingness to try new foods and new places when old ways no longer worked. Maybe it was just stubborn persistence, the refusal to give up even when the odds seemed impossible. We carry all of these potentials within us. The same genetic heritage that got our ancestors through the volcanic winter is still present in humanity today. We are the descendants of survivors, shaped by thousands of generations of overcoming challenges. The question is whether we will honor that heritage, whether we will face our own challenges with the same resilience that brought our ancestors through theirs, whether the chain of survival that has stretched unbroken for 3 million years will continue into the future. If you are still awake, think about that the next time you face something difficult. You come from a long line of people who did not give up. Whatever they faced, they found a way through. That resilience is part of who you are. And if you are drifting off to sleep, let that be the thought you carry into your dreams. You are connected to something vast and ancient. The 74,000 years since Toba are just a moment in the long story of life on Earth. But they are your moment, your chapter in the story. Somewhere in Indonesia, Lake Toba is still and quiet under the stars. The supervolcano sleeps beneath its waters. The world has healed from the ancient catastrophe, though the marks remain hidden in our genes and in the rock record. Scientists will continue to debate what exactly happened 74,000 years ago. New discoveries will emerge from archaeological digs and genetic laboratories. The story will be refined and perhaps transformed by evidence we have not yet found. Perhaps someday we will have ancient DNA from the volcanic winter period itself, extracted from bones or teeth preserved in just the right conditions. That could tell us definitively how many humans were alive during the crisis and where they lived. But the fundamental mystery will endure. How close did we really come to extinction? What would the world look like if those few survivors had not made it through? These questions do not have definitive answers, and perhaps that is appropriate. The universe keeps some of its secrets. No matter how much we learn, there will always be things we do not know and cannot know. The distant past is particularly resistant to our investigations. We can piece together fragments, but the full picture remains forever incomplete. The universe is not obligated to make sense to us, or to preserve the evidence we need. We are left with fragments and inferences, building the best understanding we can from incomplete information. That is the human condition, in science as in life. What matters is that we keep asking questions, keep investigating, keep trying to understand where we came from and what it means. The search for answers is as important as the answers themselves, because it connects us to the mystery of our own existence. So as this night grows quieter and deeper, carry with you the knowledge that you are part of something extraordinary. The improbable chain of events that led to your existence stretched through one of the greatest catastrophes in human history, and you are here. Think about all the things that had to go right for you to exist. All the ancestors who survived long enough to have children, all the close calls and narrow escapes across 3 million years of human and pre-human evolution. The volcanic winter has long since ended. The ash has settled and turned to soil. Forests have grown back and evolved and changed and grown back again countless times. The world has transformed beyond recognition from the blasted landscape our ancestors endured. Somewhere in those ancient forests, or on those healing coastlines, your ancestors found ways to continue. They had children, and their children had children, and so on down through the ages, until eventually there was you. But somewhere in your cells there is an echo of that time. The genetic legacy of survival, passed down through 100,000 generations, continuing its journey into the future. You are both the inheritor and the transmitter of that legacy. Someday, if you have children or have already had them, you will have passed that legacy forward. The genetic information that helped your ancestors survive the volcanic winter will continue its journey through time, written into new bodies, meeting new challenges. If you are using this to help you sleep, I hope these thoughts have been good company for your drift into dreams. The mysteries of human origins will wait for another night, another quiet hour of wondering about where we came from and what it means. There are so many more mysteries to explore. Why do we dream? Why do we age? Why do we create art and music and tell stories around fires? Each question leads to a dozen more, each answer revealing new depths of ignorance. And if you want to explore more mysteries like this one, subscribe and stick around. There are so many more questions to ask about our strange and unlikely species, so many more gaps in our knowledge where wonder can flourish. Tomorrow you can return to your ordinary concerns, the bills and the errands and the endless small tasks that fill up a human life. But tonight, for just this moment, you have contemplated something vast. For now, rest well. Let go of the day and its demands. 74,000 years ago, your ancestors survived something almost unimaginable. Tonight, you can simply close your eyes and be grateful that they did. Let the thoughts of ancient volcanic winters fade away. Let the debates of scientists grow quiet. Let the mysteries remain mysteries for now. There will be time for answers later. Tonight is for rest. The world will be here tomorrow, with all its mysteries intact. The story of Toba will continue to unfold as scientists make new discoveries, and you will wake up the latest link in an ancient chain of survivors, ready to face whatever your day brings. Whatever that day holds, remember this: you are the product of millions of years of successful survival. You carry within you the adaptability and resilience that got your ancestors through the worst catastrophes nature could throw at them. Sleep well. Dream of ancient landscapes and modern cities, of volcanic winters and summer sunlight, of all the generations that carried the spark of life forward to you. The volcanic winter is over. You are here, and that is a kind of miracle worth remembering.